So I didn't update the picture, right? There was a lot less gray in the beard in that one, so I'll just keep that one permanently, I think. Okay, so I'm not going to do like a product pitch today. What I want to talk about is energy grids. Why are we talking about energy grids, kind of in the scope of IoT, and why is it like the IoTSF's first working group? Because there's this sort of perfect storm of investment and communication and cybersecurity challenges which are really, really relevant for this group. Why is there tons of investment? Well, and for example, like in the US over the last 12 years, grid providers invested about $700 billion in infrastructure. Over the next 5, they're going to put about $1.4 trillion in, right? So the rate of increase is obviously going up, largely driven by the growth of data centers and especially AI data centers, right? Because we all know that like a ChatGPT search takes about 10 times the power of a simple Google search, right? So this is making this really interesting sort of opportunity and some worst case scenarios for cybersecurity. But to better understand where we are today, let's talk about how we got here. So if you rewind the clock to the 1990s or even the 1890s, power grids were pretty simple, right? There was a big coal plant somewhere on the outskirts of town, and energy flow was one way, like it went from the power plant outwards to your homes and shops and factories and that stuff. And if you want to sort of forecast your energy demand, you look at the day of the week. Oh, it's Thursday. You look out the window. Oh, it's about 22 Celsius. So I know about what my energy demand is going to be. And the feedback loop from your house or store or whatever back to power generation was, those of you who are as old as I am will remember meter readers. Remember the people who would come out to your house with like the clipboard and the notepad, and they would write down how much energy you used this month, and they would take it back to Central, and then a week or two later, you would get an energy bill, right? So not very responsive. So the first real innovation we added in terms of kind of grid modernization was smart meters. Now, these communicated, we didn't have 5G and LoRa and things like that. So they actually used PLC, like power line communication. And there was one-way communication, but back. So that was really handy because now, if you're a power generator and, some factory decides to go to double shift and, they're working all night or something, you've got real-time or at least near-time feedback about that now. And so hey, I need to up my energy generation. The big step forward here was having communication like on the grid for the first time so that generation could respond to demand. So remember I said your coal plant, whatever, nuclear, was pretty static back then. The next thing we added were renewables, right? Which are great. They're clean and things like that, but they're variable, right? The wind can blow or not blow. The sun can shine or as about, 322 days a year in London, the sun cannot shine, right? And so you're not generating a lot of power. So this means you needed to be, and by the way, if you're not familiar with kind of energy grids, they're very finicky. The power level on the grid has to be kept within a really, really narrow range. Too much or too little, really bad things happen, right? And so now you needed real-time communication about how much energy these variable sources were generating and how much they could supply to the grid so that you could manage that and make sure you didn't have too much or too little power. I'm actually working with one customer now, won't say who, but they deployed a bunch of solar ahead of the deployment of smart inverters and a well-communicating grid. So on really sunny days, they have to do truck rolls and go turn off solar fields. Not a very efficient mechanism there. Okay, so that solar thing kind of worked so well, the next big step forward was people started putting things like rooftop solar on their houses and shops and things like that. This was really a big sort of development for two reasons. One is that energy flow is now bidirectional, right? Because it used to be that you made energy at one place and you sent it out. But now your house with a solar panel, it could be a net energy consumer or it could be a net supplier. So this makes the communication much more important, right? Because you've got to not just know if energy is coming, but if this thing is consuming energy or supplying it back to me. Now, from a security perspective, anybody want to guess what the big challenge here was with like adding things like rooftop solar? For the first time, really, no guesses? For the first time, energy grids were dependent for resiliency on things that the utility operator didn't own, right? Because typically they owned like the wind, the solar farm, the power plant, or at least they had a really tight relationship with the operator. Now, the consumer can just go out, buy their solar panels, buy their, inverters from wherever, from eBay or whatever, and stick it on their house. And that thing has to communicate with the grid, right? Because we got to maintain the right power levels. But they have no control over the security of that device. So that was the first time that we really started to see kind of major cybersecurity vulnerabilities in, IoT devices, writ large, impacting the grid. Next big innovation was energy storage, right? So as I mentioned, we have this like variable power stuff. So we had to add basically big batteries. Now, initially these were distributed kind of at the substation level. And basically they kind of make up for the gaps in, wind and solar and things like that. But again, they were complex because we've got bidirectional energy flow. When you've got too much energy on the grid, you're powering up the batteries. When you've got too little, you're draining energy from them. So your communication, your management becomes one step more complex, and you've got to communicate with all of these devices. So the next really big tectonic shift here was EVs. Now EVs added like tons of complexity of communication challenges and cybersecurity challenges. So, all right, I'll try this again. What's a big difference between like your house and your car? Anybody? Cars move, right? So your house probably, barring like big wind events, your house is going to stay still. But your car is going to move around. So that means you might charge it up at home, or you might take it to the car park by your office and charge it up there, right? So that makes it much harder for like the grid provider to sort of forecast demand, right? Because these things can move around. And those cars, or lorries, whatever, buses, those can be both sinks and sources for the grid, right? Tesla just applied to be an energy provider here in the UK, right? And the idea is that you can sort of aggregate all of the collected batteries of, cars behind a charge point operator, basically the person who operates like all the charging stations, and all those car batteries can act in a pinch like power for the grid, right? So this adds, again, lots of communication. You've got many different owners of the charging stations. The charging stations themselves, by the way, talk to cars basically over Ethernet. Like it looks like a power cord, but there's an Ethernet signal across that cable where they talk to each other. There's a specific charge protocol. Then there's a protocol on the back end of the charging station. Eventually it'll be IEEE 2030.5 that goes and talks to the back end stuff. But this adds another challenge because not only can the charging station be hacked, which I might want to do if I want, free energy for my car, but cars can be hacked, right? So there's lots of places that bad stuff can be introduced into the grid, right? So the security of all of these. Now, I will mention that many of the people who build all the devices for utilities and cars and things like that, smart inverters, they don't think of themselves as IoT manufacturers, even though those of us in the room probably do, right? So if you think about how far we've come in just, 25 years from this really simple, coal plant somewhere that sent power out to this highly integrated, interconnected, mess with a much greater attack surface, it's really a dramatic transformation in a very, very small amount of time. So what does that mean? When I say bigger attack surface, and especially one that's so critical for like keeping your country's lights on, that makes it a bigger target for attack, right? And we've seen multiple instances of like cyber attacks on energy grids. Most famous is, of course, Ukraine, right? The Ukrainian grid is basically like a cat toy for the GRU, right? This is where they sort of beta test all their bad software. It also illustrates the kind of nightmare scenario of grid cybersecurity attacks. Now we've also seen ransomware attacks in South Africa and other places. There was actually like a hacktivist attack in Russia that took out power station or charging stations for a while. You know, for those of us in the States, one of the most disturbing things, we recently found that the Volt Typhoon, APT, had been active in the grid in Massachusetts for nearly a year, like over 300 days, without detection before we found it, right? Now, we might say, yay, we caught it before they did anything. It's actually kind of bad. You know, the bad part is that they were active for that long before anyone knew, because the nightmare scenario in grid attacks is that you'll basically, the threat actor will leave malware behind, and it will sit there sort of dormant until something else happens, or until the threat actor wants to do something bad. Of course, a kinetic attack, like in Georgia or in Ukraine, you know, Russia's going in, they want to take out the power grid. Maybe you wait for a natural disaster and you compound the effects of that. There's a wildfire in California and you shut out all the lights. You can rest assured that when and if China decides to go into Taiwan, you can expect global grid disruptions as a big distraction and to limit the ability of anyone who might want to respond to that to do so. So why are these grids so vulnerable to these attacks? In many cases, much more so than like traditional IT. Part of this is, if we go back in time, remember, to like when we first got communicating devices on the grid, a lot of those things are still out there, right? The duty cycle of a lot of these devices is not measured in years, it's measured in decades. And in fact, a lot of these started out, you know, some critical grid device, synchrophaser, PLC, whatever, would be connected to a management station with a serial cable. So it'd have an RS-232 or 432 interface, and the manager would be here, and then there'd be a cable, and you'd like turn some dials, and it would do something. And then someone said, hey, I want to cut costs, so I'm going to stick a little serial to Ethernet interface at both ends of this connection, and now I can manage it remotely. Like, yay, yeah, good for efficiency, but there's no authentication. There's no encryption to that. And in fact, a lot of these devices, if you've messed with them, a ping packet will brick them because they're designed to receive exactly one kind of packet, and say they see anything else, they don't really know how to respond to that, right? So a lot of this stuff, it may not even be possible to apply a firmware update. The manufacturer, you know, probably still doesn't support the device. They certainly, if there were firmware updates, the last one may have been a decade ago. So it's really, and a firmware update may involve downtime, so the light's going out. So it's really, really hard to update a lot of these things in the field. And just from a budget perspective, the way that a lot of utilities work, it's, I won't say easy, but it's possible to get money for new stuff like grid expansion. Oh, we got new people being employed in this factory, so we're going to add new power capacity. But to replace something that's working just because of a potential security threat, that's a lot harder. And also, there's not a lot of antivirus software available for smart inverters and car charging stations and stuff, right? So we don't have a lot of kind of direct security tools for a lot of these things. And as I mentioned, the grid operator, even if they had good funding, they don't own a lot of the devices that they're dependent on, right? So what can we do? So monitoring is, of course, important. In fact, in the States, we just passed something called NERC-CIP 15, which basically mandates better kind of lateral monitoring in grid networks, which is a good thing because that'll help us detect things like, you know, Chinese threat actors that are sitting there for a long time. But, and coming from, by the way, if you don't know Keysight, we were founded in 1939 as Hewlett-Packard, biggest test and measurement, you know, company in the world. We're a big fan of proactive testing. So if you're a manufacturer and you're building things, or you're deploying stuff on your grid, or you're a grid operator, whatever, and you want to understand where your exposures are, you would be really well served to do some proactive testing, whether it's vulnerability analysis, firmware analysis, look at the firmware on the devices, generate an SBOM, look at the vulnerabilities in those libraries, and then you can mitigate the threats. You can optimize replacement, or you can prioritize replacement, and then design your kind of security tools around what you know the exposures are. So if you can't replace things, at least you can approach the security aspect of that in an intelligent way, right? So, I'm not going to give a big product pitch. I will just say Keysight has a lot of experience in this space. We do not only the cybersecurity part, which I'm interested in, but we also do things like digital twins, because it turns out it's a lot easier if you want to know how a big grid will respond to someone, say, knocking over a telephone or a lamp post and taking down the power lines. It's a lot cheaper to do that in a simulation than in real life. But we do grid emulation and battery testing and battery emulation, hardware in the loop testing. If you have any interest in this space at all, we've got a booth upstairs. Please come by. Love to talk to you about some of this stuff. We also make really cool, ruggedized field monitoring stuff. Do packet collection off of, the grid networks. So one of the tools that we have, and we can talk about this upstairs, we've got a really cool tool that lets you basically take any kind of connected device. It can be a car, it can be a smart thermostat, a piece of equipment from an energy grid, and do really, really proactive testing in an easy way. So the reality is there aren't that many cybersecurity experts out there. And when you can find them, they're typically not cheap and they move around a lot, right? So we've tried to package a lot of expertise and put it in just a little desktop appliance. So if you want to do protocol fuzzing, defined unknown vulnerabilities in communication stacks, Bluetooth Low Energy, Wi-Fi, CAN bus, whatever, TCP IP implementations, I said, you can brick these things pretty easily. We will let you do that kind of testing without having to manually build the tools. Vulnerability assessment, scanning a device for known vulnerabilities, optimized for kind of IoT devices, meaning really good ADB support and things like that. We've got that. And one of the recent additions, we've got SBOM generation. So I think everybody here probably knows what an SBOM is. We can either do it on-prem, on the appliance, if you want to keep everything in-house, or we got a more robust cloud version, so you can ship stuff out to the cloud and then publish your SBOMs to your downstream consumers and things like that. Okay, so since I have another minute or two, we're not done, I just want to share an example of this. So I had an intern last summer. So super bright kid, but just a college student, right? Now he does go to Georgia Tech, my alma mater, so he's obviously smart. But it was the very end of the summer, and I told him that I was working on power grid stuff. He had been working on some other projects. He's like, "Hey, I got a week left. You want me to try some power grid stuff?" I'm like, "Sure." So we went on eBay, and he bought. I can't say the brand because we've reported it to them, but the CVE hasn't been published yet. They haven't issued the fixes for this yet, but probably a household name of a smart inverter, right? And starting with the tool that I just showed you and then doing a little more work on his own, he found a ton of really, really critical vulnerabilities in the smart inverter, including you could, there's an HTTP to HTTPS redirect, great, but you could actually authenticate over HTTP. So you could authenticate over clear text. Now the password, at least to their credit, the default password is printed on a sticker on the inside of the plastic lid. So only if you walk up, to the side of the house, maybe and open the thing, could you know what the password is. There is no prompt on first use to change the password. And if either locally or remotely you force a factory reset, the username and password reset to UBNT. So now you know what kind of Linux it's based on, right? Passwords were actually stored in clear text, which is kind of weird. Tons of open ports, things like that. So, without much work at all, and again, this is a really popular inverter. Basically, anyone with some simple hacking tools could get access to the system and remotely control it, right? And if they can do all sorts of bad things to your house, to the grid, to things like that. This is not uncommon. I think this is, what we found here. And again, it's what one student found in a week. So you can be pretty certain that especially in devices that have been sitting out on the grid for 20 years and haven't been updated in a long time, Yeah, they're probably not doing much better than this. They may not even have encryption, which is something else that we see. Okay, and that brings to the end of the presentation. I don't know if I've got a minute or two for questions. If I don't, we'll take one. One if we've got it, and otherwise we got a booth upstairs, and please come see us.
Any questions?
Going once, going twice. Okay, if not, please, we got a booth, back corner of the room. Please come and find us. Thank you very much.
I'll register everybody.